Grace Givergis Markoulilos, Your Grace Dr. Givergis Markoulilos, Metropolitan of Ahmedabad, my esteemed panelists on the dais, Professor M.P. Matthew, Sister B.K. Vinayana, and my religious guides and fathers, reverend fathers from the four corners of India and beyond the seas. It is indeed both a privilege and an honor for me to be here this afternoon to participate in what is the 6th Biennial Priest Conference at Ahmedabad. I am one of those who has been associated with the Ahmedabad parish right from the 60s, the late 60s, and I have watched it grow from strength to strength. That it is today a diocese presided over by a person as dynamic, as much a visionary, and as much a leader as Markoulilos is a matter of immense pride for me. It is to his credit and to the credit of the parish of Ahmedabad and the Diocese of Ahmedabad that they have now the confidence to be able to organize national level events like this. So let me begin by offering my congratulations and kudos to the diocese and to the many people who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes, some of them who are very close friends of mine. Why did I choose this topic? Let me at the outset confess that I feel very much an outsider here. I am facing for the first time a room full of religious fathers and people who are well versed and scholars of our church. And on the platform are two equally spiritual people. Professor Mathai, who is one of the most renowned scholars of Gandhism in India, and Sister Vinayana, who represents the tradition of the Brahma Kumaris. So I am really an outsider. I belong to that alien world which deals with administration and politics and wheeling, dealing and corruption, which is alien to this august body. But why do I think it is important? I think it is important for a couple of reasons. Next. I think every priest at some time in the course of his life faces a dilemma. He faces a split personality, if you could say. On one hand, he is a religious leader, he is a spiritual leader, and as Christ said, the shepherd of his flock. And he lives and thrives in a spiritual world. But because he is a citizen of civil society, he is also asked to perform social functions. He may be a school principal, heading an NGO, running a college, and therefore he cannot cease to be a quote-unquote political figure. Thus, he has the difficult task of reconciling and straddling two worlds. And this often poses problems. My contention today to you is that while you are immersed deep in the spiritual world, while you have been trained in the Bible and in theology by professors as eminent as Tirumeni himself, Can you ask yourself and give a truthful answer whether you are also as interested and as deeply committed to the democracy that we live in? Because you cannot escape the fact that at the end of the day, you are a citizen of free India. The problem I'm posing, therefore, is not whether it is desirable to know how government works. The question is not whether each one of us should take an interest in government. I go one step further and say it is the basic fundamental duty of every one of us as citizens of a free and democratic country to know how government works. We do not cease, a priest does not cease to be a citizen just because he's a priest. He's a priest as well as a citizen of a functioning democracy. Next. The clash has taken place because throughout the centuries there has been a conflict between what is known as the church and the state. And there has been various attempts either to merge the two, to make it one entity, as it has happened in theocratic states, in Pakistan and in Iraq. These are states which are theocratic by definition, where the state and religion have merged into one entity. And the ruler of the state is also the head of the church. And the best example of this was what happened during the Reformation in England. Next. When this issue was debated hotly. And if we were to ask what was the first articulation of this word we call secularism today. Secularism is a hotly debated topic. If we were to ask what is secularism today, we would have to look to perhaps the finest definition of secularism, which is in the Bible itself, where Christ was very, very clear in his thinking. And he said that there is a world of the spirit and a world of politics. The politics being represented by Caesar. And he was very clear in his mind that these two should be separated, ought to be separated. Well, if that is the case, then the question arises, how do we do justice to both? How do we reconcile being members of these two entities which are by definition different? Next. Henry VIII created the Church of England. Some people say because of personal reasons, but historians will tell you that there was a host of reasons, not just his own, which led to the split between the church and state. But secularism has been accepted as one of the pillars of democracy. Without secularism, a state soon deteriorates into anarchy or authoritarianism. And therefore, we need secularism to permit us to grow more fully as spiritual human beings, where we have the freedom and the elbow room to develop ourselves spiritually without the intrusion of the church. It is this fact alone that enables us to function within the four walls of a state as free individual citizens with the freedom to grow spiritually. Now, this being the background, the question therefore is, how do we understand more of the state? How do we comprehend the state so that we can continue to be effective and well-adjusted citizens politically, while at the same time enjoying the religious freedom? Next. We have to bridge the gap between the church and the state to be able to function effectively in both realms, both as a member of the church, a member of any religion, and at the same time, we wear two hats as a full-fledged citizen of democracy. Next. So in order to continue this journey, the question that one is asked to start the journey is, what is government? An understanding of this concept of government is fundamental to our ability to reconcile ourselves to live in this society. And as I said, remember all the time that we are full-fledged citizens as well as members of a religious community. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of definitions. Volumes of books have been written on people attempting to define government. I happen to teach a course on governance at the University in Ahmedabad. And I begin my lectures by posing this question to my students. And I try to illustrate it by a folk story which is common in cultures across India. Next. What is government, and this elephant, what does it have in common? You are all familiar with, I think every culture, and I travel across the country, every culture has a story which parallels this story. It's the story of 6 blind men who went to discover an elephant. The 6 blind men of Hindustan, as the poem goes, who went to discover what an elephant is. How many of you have heard this story? Can you just raise your hands? Almost 80-90%. Now, your concept of government depends on your individual interaction with government. If you are a lawyer, government to you is the courts, the hierarchy of the courts, the high courts, the district court, the Supreme Court. If you are a doctor, the health department of the government, the medical colleges, the district hospitals, the various rules and regulations pertaining to health is government for you. If you are a lawyer, perhaps the sales tax department would be government for you. Just as the 6 blind men who went to discover an elephant touched one part of its body and came to the conclusion that this for me is government. Next. So these 6 people went, and one of them touched the tusk and said that the elephant is a spear. Or somebody touched the tail and said the elephant is a rope. Somebody touched the legs of the elephant and said it's a pillar. The side of the elephant, a wall. And they came back and announced that they have discovered what the elephant is. And when each one was asked to explain, he said the elephant is nothing but a rope or nothing but a spear, and so on. Next. And had that been true, you would have a very curious animal who was not an elephant at all. And there's a beautiful poem in the English language which narrates the expedition of these 6 people. And it ends by saying that though all of them were partly in the right, all of them were wrong. So our concept of government is conditioned by our individual exposure to a part of government. To look at government holistically, one needs to step back and examine what is it that touches the lives of all of us. Because every citizen of this country cannot escape interacting with government, and it is our duty to understand what this entity is. Next. I have quickly looked at various definitions of government, and perhaps out of all the learned definitions, as it happens in modern day and age, Wikipedia had the best definition. And I have tried to put it down that the government is the organization or an agency through which political unit exercises its authority, controls and administers public policy, and directs and controls actions of its members and subjects. Just note it and keep it at the back of your mind. Next. You know, in order to understand government, as it is to understand any subject, one needs to go through a little bit of its history. Now, we don't have time to examine the sociological and anthropological origins of government. So let me quickly run you through a 3-minute crash course on the history of government. Maybe in 3 minutes. Let us try to look at quickly at its history. Next. As you are aware, the early human beings were tribals. And they were what sociologists call hunters and gatherers. They used to move from place to place, hunting and gathering leaves and berries and fruits and eating. And they lived nomadic lives. Next. But all these tribals had a tribal chieftain. They had a head. And what did this person, this head of the tribe, do? He did 3 functions. He made laws, he implemented the laws, and if there was a dispute between 2 people in his tribe, he sat in judgment over that dispute. Next. In course of time, these tribals discovered agriculture, found out the secret of sowing wheat, sowing crops, waiting for it to get harvested, and they realized that they need not travel around the countryside looking for food because they understood what is agriculture. Next. And civilizations, towns and cities started on the banks of rivers, which was essential, water being essential for agriculture. Next. And these cities and towns on the banks of rivers grew into the seats of civilization, the seats of the original city-states, the seats of small kingdoms. And history tells us that the Nile, Euphrates, Tigris, Yangtze, these became the cradles of civilization, and these were where kingdoms flourished. Next. Instead of the tribal chief, you then had the king. A king who ruled over that particular unit of human habitation. The collection of human beings who lived in that place was ruled by a king. But remember, and this is where I want you to underline and note, this king also performed those 3 functions: laying down the law, implementing the law, and arbitrating in disputes. And it is these 3 functions which continued to play a role in simple human groups as well as in complicated kingdoms and states. Next. The modern state is, of course, very complex, but it has within it the seed of the original state. However complex a modern state is in terms of population, in terms of economic activity, in terms of groups, in terms of the need of the people and the complexity of governance, the state remains a unit which requires the need for an administrator. And the modern government also performs 3 functions. Next. The 3 functions of laying down the law, implementing the law, and arbitrating between disputes is the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So the original primitive function of the tribal chief through the centuries and ages evolved into the modern government, which continues to play the 3 roles that the original tribal chieftain played: laying down the law, The legislature, whether it is the Parliament of India or the State Legislative Assembly, they make laws. The executive ensures that laws are implemented. And if there is a dispute between citizens, there is a system of courts called the judiciary which arbitrates for the dispute. So however complex it is, these are the three functions of government. And when we talk of government, remember that we are talking of these three arms of government which jointly is called government. The legislature, the executive and the judiciary. Next. It's important to understand this evolution. Just as the single-celled organism, you must remember your days of studying biology in school, where a single-celled amoeba has evolved into a trillion-cell human being in all its glory and complexity. But the single-celled amoeba has the same systems that govern the human body. It has a digestive system, it has a tact system, a sensory system, it has a digestive system, it has a circulatory system. It has only evolved in complexity, the systems remain the same. Next. So the three arms of government is what we are concerned with. The legislature, the executive and the judiciary, which together form government. Next. The legislature is the law-making body and is symbolized by the Parliament of India, the State Legislative Assembly, and if you come down to the city level, the urban local bodies, our municipal corporations and municipalities at the third level. So we really have a three-tier government, where at each tier law is made. Next. The executive consists of the entire hierarchy of people right from the President of India, right down to the Talati or Parvotiyar at the village level, which constitutes the army of officials who are there to implement the laws. And very often, we tend to think of the executive as the government, because the executive is the face of government. It is the executive with whom we interact most often. Whether it is the collector or the district superintendent of police or the secretary to the government, these are all part of the executive. Or even the chief minister and his cabinet, they are all executives, part of the executive group or the part of government. And next, and the judiciary, the hierarchy of courts which come into play only to settle disputes and arbitrate between citizens who differ or institutions who differ, who have a difference of opinion or a dispute. Next. So remember that when we talk of government, we are really talking of these three separate parts. And these three separate parts have their own distinct and individual functions and distinct and individual personalities. There are three key features of government which will give you an understanding of how this whole thing works, how governance takes place. And it's important to remember these. A modern democratic state works on three important principles. If these three important principles are not blended into the laws and regulations of the state fails. We refer to Pakistan as a failed state. The state doesn't function, it is a sick state. And to the extent that these three functions are strong, the state itself becomes strong, freedom is ensured, individual liberty is ensured, the state flowers, the personality of its citizens flowers. What are these three pillars on which the modern state is built? The first is the theory of separation of powers. Next. It was commented upon, I won't say he discovered it or invented it. Montesquieu, a French philosopher, wrote extensively on the separation of powers, which basically means that these three organs of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, have to remain separate, have to work in three watertight compartments. Now, the first reaction of many people is that this is ridiculous. If they work together, is it not better for the citizen? On the contrary, it is in the interest of the citizen that each of these three organs of government remain in their watertight compartments, totally independent from each other. Why do I say this? Consider a situation that a citizen is arrested for whatever fault. He is picked up by the police inspector and taken to jail. Just imagine for a moment that when he is produced in the court the next day, the person presiding over the case is the police inspector himself. You cannot imagine it. Because justice is guaranteed only if the executive, represented by the police inspector, and the judiciary, represented by the judge, are two independent people who independently apply their mind. So if a person is produced before the court, whoever he is, from a peon to the chief minister of a state, the judge will look at him unbiased and weigh the evidence before sentencing him or letting him go. If the judge is in fact the prosecutor or in fact the executive, justice will be alright. The inspector who arrested you in the first place because he had a grudge against you or your brother or your family will never allow you to go. But you need an independent judge to come, apply his mind, independent of the executive. Similarly, there is the independence of the judiciary and the executive, the legislature and the executive. All this triangular arrangement works best when each is independent of the other. The MLA or the MP does not have executive powers. I am sure all of you are aware what could possibly go wrong if an MLA or MP was also given the powers of a collector. As it is, he is interfering anyway. But if he was empowered to act as a collector or a secretary, how many things could go wrong? So it is in the interest of the citizen that these three organs, these three institutions work in separate watertight compartments. And the check and balance of one on the other ensures that you and I sleep well at night. Whenever there is a state where the executive and judiciary have overlap, the sufferer is the citizen. How often have we heard of stories of the midnight knock? Somebody is arrested, his family does not know what has happened to him. This happens every day in countries where this separation of power is not there. How often have we heard of rich and powerful getting away with murder because they feel that they are influencing the judiciary? As long as judiciary is independent, as long as the appointment and the promotion and the pay and the salary of judges are delinked from the executive, the citizen is happiest. Next. I quickly go over because these are explanations of it. Next. Next. This is all explanation of how each organ is independent of the other. Next. Next. The second pillar of a democratic state is the principle of the rule of law. Now it's very easy for us to say, yes, of course, we accept the rule of law. Everybody is equal before law. But rule of law is a very technical and scientific subject. When we say rule of law, it implies several important things. The first is that under rule of law, law has to be passed through a procedure where the people themselves are to be involved. A law is not a diktat or a decree issued by the ruler. If that is the case, it is not law in the democratic sense. A law becomes law only if it goes through what is known as the actual process of enactment. Within the state legislative assembly or the parliament, there is set procedure by which a law is passed. There is debate, there is discussion, there is vote, there is consultative committee meetings, there is inputs by experts, and finally the law is passed. Once the law is passed, the second part of the rule of law is that it cannot be retrospectively applied. It is applied from the day it is passed. And the third part of the rule of law is that if a person's life or liberty is to be curtailed, the due process of law has to be followed. If a government servant who is corrupt has to be dismissed, however powerful the boss is, however strong the chief minister is, he cannot be dismissed unless a certain procedure is followed. He is given a notice, he has time to explain, his explanation is examined, the competent authority takes a decision, and he has a right to appeal over that decision. Unless this, which is laid down in the law, is followed, it is not rule of law. And of course, everybody is equal in the eyes of law. These are the components of the rule of law, which is an important part of governance. Next. I have mentioned what I mentioned, the rule of law, how it works. Next. The last point in this explanation of the tenets or pillars of government is the principle of no taxation without representation. This was the slogan, the war cry, the mantra of the American War of Independence. Just as we fought the British, the Americans also fought against the British and threw them out. But for the Americans, the key was no taxation without representation. What does it mean? It means that as citizens of a free democracy, government cannot recover a single naya paisa without the sanction of the parliament. Nor can it spend a single naya paisa without the sanction of the parliament. Now, it is easy to say that, but it's an extremely important part of governance. The budget, which is passed in the parliament every year, is passed as a law. Please remember that. Budget is a law. The entire parliament has to pass that budget. They debate it, they discuss it, at the end they have to pass it by a majority. Only after that budget is passed is the government permitted to spend even one naya paisa. It's an interesting thought that if for some reason the parliament cannot meet by 31st March, what would happen to this country? Government would grind to a halt. No single salary can be paid, no contractor can be paid. The government's financial transactions comes to a complete and total halt. Because no money can be spent unless there is a sanction for it. Those of you who have been following American newspapers would note that almost something similar to that happened in USA. Obama could not pass the budget in time, and federal services in USA almost came to a halt. until a deal was worked out and the budget was passed. Similarly, in India, unless the budget is passed, government cannot function. And passing of budget is not a routine exercise, it is an expression of the will of the people, authorizing government to tax the citizens, raise resources, and then secondly, use the resources in the way and manner which the parliament decides. The budget of each department is passed as part of the budget exercise. The reason I have spent a little time on this is to drive home the point basically that as citizens of India, we have a moral duty to understand how this works. It is not enough that we give our vote once in 5 years and wait for the next elections. Unless we take a genuine interest in the working of the government, unless we question our elected representatives, and unless we demand that we are the masters as the people of India and our government and our representatives are merely following our advice, democracy itself weakens. There is an American proverb which says, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Unless we, each one of us is vigilant and participates in a proactive way in the governance of this country will go down the drain. The next generation and the generation after that will suffer because we have not understood the value of democracy and the value of participative democracy. There is this famous, I will end with this famous poem which was written by a person who suffered under Nazi. And he was lamenting the fact that I did not really care about what was happening around me. It's a beautiful poem. Unfortunately, I have not brought it with me, but I usually quote it to my class. And he talks of the fact that when the police came and arrested the communists, I did not protest because I was not a communist. The next day, the police came and went to my neighbor's house and arrested the trade unionists. I did not protest because I was not a trade unionist. The third day they came and arrested some NGOs. I said, why should I bother? I am not an NGO. Finally, they came to my house to arrest me and there was no one left to protest.